So now that our samples are all cut and pinned together, we've got 2 layers of rectangles that I've pinned together on the 6-inch side using 6 pins, just like the instructions say. Right there, together along the 6-inch side using 6 pins. The next thing we're going to do is do the actual simple seams. When they're done, this is what your samples will look like. Okay? This is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. They coincide with these numbers here. The only trick, if you will, with these seams is that we're going to manipulate how long the stitch length is, and then when you do a zigzag, how wide the stitch length is. So for the first one on the paper, it says straight stitch a seam with a stitch length 5 and a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Remember, on our needle plate, the 5/8 is always marked, and then each line to the left or the right is equivalent to 1/8. So if you find the 5/8 on your needle plate, one line to the left is going to be 1/2 inch, one line to the right of 5/8 will be 3/4. Each one of those lines signifies 1/8 of an inch. If you're still using tape on your needle plate, that's fine. I'm not going to use it today, but if you still do, that's fine. So my seam allowance is a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to find 5/8, which is right here. I'm going to move my fabric over one line to the left to make it 4/8 or a 1/2 inch. Up here at the top, you're going to change for number 1 the stitch length to a 5. Same rules apply with simple seams. You're going to go forward 3, back 3 with your back stitching. And you go 1, 2, 3 forward, and then hold in the back button and go backwards all the way to the end of the fabric. In a perfect world, it would be 3 stitches, but sometimes it's a stitch more. With a stitch length 5, the machine takes the material a lot quicker than you're used to. So just control your foot pedal and make sure that it doesn't get out of control. When you get to the end, you're going to backstitch. Pull it off and cut your threads. Okay, so it should look just like number 1. Let me trim my threads. It should. The next one, it's going to be a straight stitch as well. Stitch length 2.5 and 3/4 seam allowance. So the first thing I'll do is I'll take my stitch length and change it to 2.5. It's right about there. 3/4 seam allowance, I'm going to find the 5/8 first, which is here. 3/4 is going to be one line to the right of the 5/8. And same thing, forward 3 and back 3. This seam has tinier stitches than you're used to, so it's going to feel like it's going super slow compared to the stitch length 5. And then when you get to the end, you're going to backstitch 3. The scissors the wrong way. I'm in the video on the other one saying scissors go the other way. And there's that one. Whoops. Number 2. For number 3, this is a zigzag seam. So the first thing we need to do over here, remember the one our machines turn on at number 1. Number 1 is the a straight stitch. Number 2 is the zigzag. When I hit number 2, you'll see the 2 pop up here, and you'll also get a width. You still have your stitch length just like our straight stitch, but now we have a width that we can program. So this one says zigzag seam with stitch length 2, so I'm going to bump up the length at 2. Stitch width at 4, so the width is the top button here. So there's your 4 for the width. With a zigzag seam, back stitching using a zigzag doesn't help. It doesn't lock anything in place. So when we do zigzag stitching, you're going to start the seam with a straight stitch, go forward 3, back 3, then hit the button for the zigzag. I've already programmed the zigzag numbers with a 2 length and a 4 width. So I'm going to hop back to a straight stitch. Make sure the straight stitch is a 3, like normal. Oh, and seam allowance is 3/8. 3/8 is marked on your machine if your buttons are black. If the buttons are red, it's not marked, but it is 2 lines to the left of the 5/8. So here's 5/8. I'm going to go 1, 2 lines to the left to give me my 3/8. Again, I'm going to start with the straight stitch and go forward 3, and then back 3, just like we did in patchwork. Then I'm going to hit the number 2 and get the width and the length and stitch. And you'll see the needle going back and forth like the letter Z for zigzag. And this seam takes a little bit longer because that needle's working a little extra hard doing that 2 rows. When I get to the end, I'm going to switch it back to a straight stitch, a number 1, and go actually backwards first, and then forwards. And pull it off and cut the thread. And hopefully, it looks just like number 3. So far, so good. Now for number 4, this one is also a zigzag seam. The stitch length on this is a 4, and the width is a 2. So I will hit the number 2 for zigzag. I'm going to change the width to a 2, and change the length to a 4. Okay. My seam allowance is 5/8, so that is our industry standard seam allowance. Got it lined up at 5/8. I switch it to a straight stitch. I go forward 3, and I go back 3. Then I hit the zigzag, following the 5/8 line. And it's okay if you guys put tape on still. That's fine. But for the video purposes, putting on tape and taking it off might be a little too cumbersome. You get to the end, you're going to switch back to a straight stitch. You're going to go backwards 3, and then forwards to the end of the fabric. And let's see if it compares to number 4. The very last one, it says to straight stitch with a stitch length of 3.5 and a 5/8 seam allowance, backstitch and press open. So I'm going to bump this up to 3.5, and it was 5/8. This is the only one that I've requested you to press open. And then you would take this to the ironing board, which I all know you know where it is, and I know that you all know how to press. So this one would get pressed open. So it would look like this sample when you're done. Make sure that you number them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The 5's under there. And then the paper, it tells you exactly how to hand it in. Very few times will I accept paper because of COVID, but for sewing samples, we're going to mount them on paper. This one tells you to fold the paper in half and staple it and put the items inside a little pocket. There you go. If you have any questions, just ask.